So here is a quick rundown of what we covered in week 2 of our class on biblical authority. We discussed the historicity of the New Testament documents. So the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died and rose again to atone for the sins of humanity, and our acceptance of these and other important Christian beliefs depends upon the reliability of the New Testament documents. So the question is, why believe that they are reliable? So in the field known as paleography or paleography, there are 3 different tests of historicity when it comes to looking at ancient documents. This is a field that is devoted to dating, deciphering, and assessing the historicity of ancient documents. And in evaluating a manuscript for its historical reliability, paleographers use 3 tests. One is the internal test, which asks, does the document itself claim to be history written by eyewitnesses? The external test, which asks, does the material, or is there material external to the document that confirms the manuscript's reliability? And then there's something called the bibliographical test, which evaluates a document on the basis of how many manuscript copies exist and how far removed they are in time from the originals. So we'll talk about the bibliographical test first. There are 2 key questions here again when it comes to this test, and one is how many manuscript copies exist. The more, the better, and how far removed they are in time from the original autographs. The earlier, the better. If you look at the notes, you'll see a list of all sorts of ancient documents, including ancient Greek philosophers and playwrights, as well as ancient Roman statesmen and historians, dating from the 5th century BC through the 2nd century AD. And then in that list is the New Testament documents, and you see that the average time span between the writing of the document is about 1,000 to 1,200 years, and the average number of copies usually around anywhere from 8, 10, 12 copies at that earliest date. In contrast, the New Testament documents, which were written in the late 1st century AD, the time span is, depending on how you measure it, whether you're talking about the very earliest copies or the earliest substantial copies that contain all or most of the New Testament, we're talking about 200 to 300 years rather than 1,000 or 1,200 years. And the number of copies, again, if we're talking the earliest manuscripts that are, say, only 100 or 150 years after the writing of the New Testament, we're talking just about a handful. But by the 5th century AD, say around 400, by then there are already at least 6,000 copies, maybe as many as 8, 10, 12,000, depending on how you count. So that'll become clear as we talk about the actual manuscript attestation of the New Testament. So there are about 5,800 Greek manuscripts that contain parts of the New Testament that are earlier than 400 AD. There are 8,000 manuscript copies of the Latin Vulgate, which is Jerome's translation that he completed around 405 AD, and then 350 copies of the Aramaic New Testament that originate in the 2nd century AD. Most are from the 5th century. Some of the earliest manuscript copies, there's the Chester Beatty papyri, which dates to the 3rd century, the Codex Sinaiticus, which is mid-4th century, the Codex Vaticanus, 4th century, the Codex Alexandrinus, and that's the 5th century. All of these contain major portions of the New Testament, and in the case of Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, it's most of the Old Testament as well as New Testament. Those are extraordinarily early manuscripts that contain all or most of the New Testament. So, in summation, the typical ancient historical work averages about 1,000-year time span between the original and the earliest copy. For the New Testament, there's only, say, a 200, 300-year gap between the originals and the earliest copies, and you have more than 5,000 manuscript copies. And only 100 or 150-year gap between the originals and the earliest manuscript copies. The conclusion we can draw here is that if any other ancient works pass the bibliographical test, then the New Testament does. New Testament passes with flying colors, in fact, even leads the way in terms of satisfying the bibliographical test. Something else that we can note here is that a document has high probability of reliability if it's intended for small audiences, which is true of most of the epistles of the New Testament. If it's written in an unpolished style, that's true of most of the New Testament. And if it contains lists of trivia and lists of details, and that's true in many instances in the New Testament. Now, moving on to the internal test, the New Testament does claim to have been written by eyewitnesses. Remember, the internal test asks that question. Does the document claim to be history written by eyewitnesses? We see, for example, in the book of Luke, Luke opens his gospel talking about the fact that the events that he's reporting were handed down to us through eyewitnesses and servants of the word, as he puts it. In 2 Peter 1, Peter says, "We did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." He says, "We ourselves heard his voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." That's a reference to the transfiguration. The first letter from John, 1 John 1, John says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we've looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We have seen it and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us." It might seem like overkill how much John is emphasizing sensory experience here. He repeatedly says these are things that we have heard, these are things that we have seen, he even says things that our hands have touched. So he's very concerned there to emphasize his eyewitness testimony. So why should these sorts of claims be trusted? Well, there are certain principles that apply here and things to consider that reinforce the reliability of these claims. One is a certain presumption of truth that guides scholars when it comes to ancient documents that claim to be history, written by eyewitnesses, that a document should be assumed trustworthy until shown unreliable. So there's a kind of innocence until guilt is proven here when you have statements about eyewitness testimony in an ancient text. Secondly, the New Testament writers had very little to gain and much to lose for lying. That's an understatement. Most of them did lose their lives and were martyred for their testimonies. And finally, a consistent tradition about Christ developed that would have been impossible had there been no eyewitness accounts to control the tradition. Other marks of historicity in the gospel that are often noted in the gospel materials. One is the distinctive features of Jesus' sayings. What we find in the gospels is a kind of internal unity and intentionality that evidences a single mind, unique mind behind them. And there are certain characteristics and terms that are found in Jesus' sayings that we find hardly anywhere else. And one that is quite unique is his use of parables. There's nothing like it in the ancient world, or really ever since. The sorts of parables that Jesus told are unique. He also is unique insofar as his use of questions. He's very Socratic in his approach. I went through the Gospel of John once and counted over 40 questions asked by Jesus. And he is using a kind of rhetorical method. He usually isn't asking questions to get information. Usually he's asking questions to make a point logically, and sometimes to refute a claim or to identify a presupposition. He's very Socratic in his teaching method. And then thirdly, the unique terms and phrases that are used by Jesus that aren't found anywhere else in the New Testament documents, like phrases like how much more, which of you, disciple, his use of the term from, or the phrase from the book of Daniel, Son of Man, how he references himself with that phrase. So you have distinctive features of Jesus' sayings. Also, there's a lack of relevant material that you would expect to be there if those who were compiling these materials were doing so just to serve the needs of the early church, as many skeptics theorize. There are no sayings of Jesus to be found on a number of critical issues that face the early church. Things like circumcision, charismatic gifts, baptism, food laws, Gentile missions, and church-state relations. Presumably, it's because there were no reliable records of Jesus speaking to these issues, and that reinforces the belief that the gospel writers did not put words in Jesus' mouth to serve the needs of the early church. And thirdly, there are irrelevant or counterproductive features. Certain elements in the gospel materials are irrelevant or counterproductive to the needs of the early church, things that you would not include if, again, you were putting these materials together and putting words into Jesus' mouth. Things like Jesus' attitude of favor towards Israel, his apparent denial of being good, his attitude towards legalism, fasting, divorce, unrepentant sinners, and women were radical, even embarrassing. And the same is true of his anger, clearing out the temple at least once, his death on a cross, the most humiliating form of capital punishment, his being a carpenter from Nazareth, and a number of other puzzling or cryptic remarks. None of those things would have been concocted by a writer that's aiming to serve the needs of the early church. Okay, so that covers the bibliographical test and the internal test. By the way, I want to credit J.P. Moreland and his book, Scaling the Secular City. I've drawn pretty heavily from his chapter on the New Testament documents, and it's extremely helpful. I highly recommend that book and that particular chapter for those who want to do more reading on this topic. Another excellent source on this subject is Paul Barnett, and his book, Is the New Testament Reliable? And that's published by InterVarsity Press. Barnett notes a number of sources and historical confirmation from those sources in the ancient world, and this applies to the external test that I mentioned earlier. So we have some important Roman sources and some significant Jewish sources as well. First, beginning with the Roman sources, including someone named Pliny, who lived in the early 2nd century. He was governor of Bithynia, and his letters provide all sorts of information that confirms the biblical accounts about the early Christians. He notes that the early Christians sometimes undermined older religions and their businesses, that Christians regularly met on a fixed day of worship, and that Christians worshiped Jesus as divine and refused to curse him. The Roman governor in Asia named Tacitus, who lived from 55 to 120 AD, in his Annals of Imperial Rome, he records how Nero blamed Christians for the Great Fire in Rome. And in his account, a number of New Testament facts are confirmed. One, that Jesus' public ministry coincided with the reign of Tiberius, that Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor at the time of Christ's death, that Jesus was executed as a criminal, that these events occurred in Judea, that the movement did not end with Jesus' death, but broke out again, as he puts it, and that the movement spread from Jerusalem to Rome. All of those reports from Tacitus confirm the biblical accounts. And then finally, there's Suetonius, whose dates are 69 to 140 AD. Like other Roman writers, Suetonius is strongly critical of Christians. He states that they embrace, as he puts it, a new and wicked superstition. His writings corroborate several points in the New Testament record, including these: that the Jews made disturbances in response to Jesus, that the Jews were expelled from Rome by Claudius in 49 AD, and that the Apostle Paul joined with Christians in Italy around 60 AD. Again, all of those reports, in this case from Suetonius, confirm the New Testament documents. Now, in addition to ancient Roman sources, there are also many ancient Jewish sources that confirm the New Testament historical record. One is Benediction 12. This is a Sanhedrin prayer composed around 80 AD, and it denigrates the Nazarene sect, that's Christianity, but in so doing confirms the existence of Judean Christians following the war in 70 AD. Next, there's the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish writings from the 5th and 6th centuries AD. And in one section, there's a reference to Jesus asserting that he, quote, practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray, end quote. And that seems to corroborate the New Testament record that Jesus performed miracles and challenged the Jewish religious practices of the day. Perhaps even the notion that Jesus was claimed to be king of the Jews. And then finally, you have the great ancient Jewish historian Josephus. In one undisputed passage of his Antiquities, he makes a summary reference to Jesus and the early Christians, which confirms each of the following New Testament teachings. One, that Jesus was called Christ, and secondly, that Jesus had a brother named James. In another passage, some aspects of which the authenticity is disputed, there is nonetheless confirmation of the New Testament record that Jesus was a teacher and a reputed wise man, that Jesus performed many apparent signs, that Jesus was claimed to be the Messiah, that he lived during the time of Pontius Pilate, and that he prompted many to follow him. Again, these confirm and corroborate the New Testament record about Jesus. Now, some complain that the New Testament documents are not reliable because the 9 or so New Testament writers were all practicing Christians. One of those claims is that, or counterclaims is that, there's no way that they could be objective or honest in their reports since they were committed Christians. Paul Barnett makes a couple of very helpful points here in response to this objection. And one is that one's personal convictions do not preclude honesty or rule out objectivity. In fact, he notes that these traits are evident in the fact that the New Testament writers included many embarrassing and confusing accounts, and they include these. One, Luke's report of the quarrel between Paul and Barnabas in Acts 15, which is a very harsh and sharp disagreement, as Luke puts it. They ended up going their separate ways. That Paul had the reaction he did to the high priest in Acts 23, which was very harsh. And that is somewhat embarrassing, certainly not. It could seem counterproductive. That Mark provides the account he does of Jesus cursing of the fig tree in Mark 11 because it was not producing fruit. That seems rather odd. That strikes us as odd to this day, among many other things that Jesus did. And John's recording of Jesus speaking to his mother in an apparently harsh way in John 2. And this is just a few examples of elements of the accounts that we get in the Gospels and the book of Acts that can seem embarrassing, confusing, counterproductive, and that it confirms that the New Testament writers really were simply reporting the facts, and they were giving us an honest depiction of events, and it shows just how objective and committed to truth they were. And secondly, the New Testament did not originally exist as a single volume, but rather as a collection of mostly independent writings by numerous authors. And that rules out any kind of collusion between them, and thus makes their agreement on points of historical detail much more trustworthy. We don't just have one gospel account, we have four. And then we have the testimonies of the other biblical writers as well. So again, as I noted in the last class, this incredible unity, historically, doctrinally, and otherwise, that you find in the New Testament, just as we find in the Old Testament, lends to the historicity and also the divine inspiration of these texts. Okay, so that completes what we talked about in week 2 of our class on biblical authority.